Once upon a time there lived a rose and a toad. The rose bush on which the rose bloomed grew in a small semicircular flower bed in front of a country house in the American countryside. The flower garden was very neglected. Weeds grew thickly over the old beds that had grown into the ground and over the paths, which had not been cleaned or graveled in a long time. The wooden lattice, with its pegs in the form of four-sided peaks, once painted with green oil paint, was now completely shabby, shriveled, and falling apart. The peaks had been picked up by the village boys to play soldiers, and by the farmers who came to the house to fend off angry dogs and other dogs. And the flower garden was no worse for the destruction. The remnants of the lattice were braided with hops, creepers with large white flowers, and sweet peas hanging in whole pale green clumps with pale purple tassels of flowers scattered about. The spiny thistles in the greasy, moist soil of the flower bed, there was a large, shady garden around it, were so large that they almost looked like trees. Yellow cowslips raised their flower-laden arrows even higher than they were. Nettles occupied a whole corner of the flower garden. They were of course burnt, but one could admire their dark green from afar, especially when they served as a background for the delicate and luxuriant pale rose blossom. It bloomed on a fine May morning. As it opened its petals, the morning dew that flew away left a few clear, transparent tears on them. The rose was surely crying. But all was so good around her, so pure and clear on that beautiful morning. When she saw the blue sky for the first time and felt the fresh morning breeze and the rays of the shining sun penetrating her delicate petals with rosy light. It was so peaceful and calm in the flower garden that if she could really cry, it was not from grief, but from happiness to live. She could not speak. She could only, bowing her head, spill a fine and fresh fragrance around her, and that fragrance was her words, her tears, and her prayer. And below, between the roots of the bush on the damp earth, as if stuck to it with its flat belly, sat a rather fat old toad who had hunted all night for worms and gnats, and in the morning had settled down to rest from his labors, having chosen a more potent and damp place. It sat with its toad eyes closed with webs and breathed hardly noticeable, bloating its dirty gray warty and sticky sides and putting one ugly paw aside. It was too lazy to move it to its belly. She was not happy about the morning, or the sun, or the good weather. She had had enough and was going to rest. But when the breeze subsided for a moment and the fragrance of the rose did not drift away, the toad felt it, and it made her uneasy. But she was long too lazy to look where the fragrance was coming from. No one had gone to the flower garden where the rose grew, and where the toad sat for a long time. Last year in the fall, on the very day when the toad, having found a good crevice under one of the stones of the foundation of the house, was about to climb into it for its winter hibernation, a little boy named Tom, who had been sitting in the flower garden every clear day under the window of the house for the whole summer, had entered it for the last time. A grown-up girl, his sister Sarah, sat by the window. She was reading a book or sewing something and occasionally glanced at her brother. He was a little boy about 7 years old, with big eyes and a big head on a skinny body. He was very fond of his flower bed. It was his flower bed, for except for him, hardly anybody went to this forsaken place. And when he came to it, he would sit down in the sunshine on an old wooden bench that stood on a dry sandy path, which had survived near the house itself because they used it to close the shutters and begin to read the book he had brought with him. "Tom, do you want me to throw you a ball?" Sister Sarah would ask from the window. "Would you like to run with it?" "No, Sarah, I'd rather sit here with a book." And he would sit for a long time and read, and when he was tired of reading about Robinsons and wild countries and sea robbers, he would leave the book open and go into the thicket of the flower garden. Here he knew every bush and almost every stem. He would squat down in front of a thick stalk of cowslip, surrounded by shaggy, whitish leaves, which was 3 times as tall as he was, and watch for a long time how the ant people ran up to their cows. Grass aphids, how the ant delicately touched the thin tubes sticking out of the aphids' backs and picked up the clear drops of sweet liquid that appeared at the tips of the tubes. He watched the dung beetle dragging its ball with care and diligence, the spider spreading a cunning rainbow net, guarding the flies, the lizard opening its blunt face, sitting in the sunshine, glistening with the green shields of its back. And once, in the evening, he saw a live hedgehog. Here he could not help his joy, and almost shouted and clapped his hands, but fearing to frighten away the prickly animal, held his breath, and opening his happy eyes wide, watched in delight as he sniffed with his pig snout at the roots of the rose bush, looking for worms between them, and wiggled his fat bear-like paws. "Tom, dear, go home, it's getting damp," said my sister loudly. And the hedgehog, frightened by the human voice, quickly pulled his prickly coat over his forehead and hind legs and turned into a ball. The boy quietly touched his prickles. The animal shrank even more and puffed and panted like a small steam engine. Then he got to know the hedgehog a little. He was such a weak, quiet, and meek boy that even the various beastly little things seemed to realize it and soon got used to him. What a joy it was when the hedgehog tasted milk from a saucer brought by the owner of the flower garden. This spring, the boy could not go out to his favorite corner. His sister was still sitting near him, but no longer at the window, but by his bedside. She was reading a book, not to herself, but aloud to him, for it was hard for him to lift his gaunt head from the white pillows, and hard to hold even the smallest volume in his skinny hands, and his eyes soon grew tired of reading. He must never go to his favorite corner again. "Sarah," suddenly he whispers to his sister. "What is it, darling? How's it going in the garden? Is it nice now? Are the roses in bloom?" His sister leans over and kisses him on his pale cheek, while discreetly wiping away a tear. "Good, my little dove, very good. And the roses are blooming. We'll go there together on Monday. The doctor will let you go out." The boy doesn't answer and sighs deeply. The nurse starts reading again. "It will be all ready. I'm tired. I'd better get some sleep." His sister adjusted his pillows and white blanket, and he turned uneasily to the wall and fell silent. The sun shone through the window overlooking the flower garden, and threw its bright rays on the bed and on the little body lying on it, illuminating the pillows and the blanket and gilding the short-cropped hair and the child's thin neck. The rose knew none of this. It was growing and showing off. The next day it was to bloom in full bloom, and the third day it would begin to wither and crumble. So much for the rose's life, but even in this short life she experienced much fear and grief. She was spotted by a toad. When it first saw the flower with its evil and ugly eyes, something strange stirred in the toad's heart. She could not tear herself away from the delicate pink petals, and kept looking and looking. She liked the rose very much, and felt a desire to be close to such a fragrant and beautiful creature. And to express her tender feelings, she could not think of anything better than such words. "Wait," she wheezed, "I'll eat you." Rose shuddered. Why was she attached to her stem? The free birds that chirped around her jumped and flew from branch to branch. Sometimes they were carried away somewhere far away, where the rose did not know. The butterflies, too, were free. How she envied them. If she had been like them, she would have flown away from the evil eyes that stalked her with their gaze. Rosa didn't know that toads sometimes stalk butterflies too. "I'll eat you," repeated the toad, trying to speak as gently as possible, which came out even more terrible and crawled closer to the rose. "I'll eat you," she repeated, still looking at the flower. And the poor creature was horrified to see how nasty sticky paws cling to the branches of the bush on which she grew. But it was difficult for the toad to climb. Her flat body could only crawl and hop freely on flat ground. After each effort, she looked up where the flower was swaying, and the rose came to a standstill. "Lord," she prayed, "if only to die another death." And the toad kept climbing higher. But where the old trunks ended and the young branches began, it had to suffer a little. The dark green, smooth bark of the rose bush was covered with sharp and strong thorns. The toad jabbed its paws and belly against them and fell to the ground, bloody. It looked at the flower with hatred. "I said I'll eat you," she repeated. Evening came. It was time to think about dinner, and the wounded toad wandered off to look for careless insects. Her anger did not prevent her from stuffing her belly as usual. Her scratches were not very dangerous, and she decided after resting to go again to the flower that attracted her and hated her. She rested for quite a long time. Morning came, noon passed, and the rose had almost forgotten her enemy. It was in full bloom and was the most beautiful creature in the flower garden. There was no one to come and admire it. The little master lay motionless on his bed. His sister did not leave his side and did not show herself at the window. Only the birds and butterflies scurried about the rose, and the bees, buzzing, sometimes landed in its open corolla and flew out from there, completely shaggy from the yellow flower dust. A nightingale flew in, climbed into the rose bush, and sang his song. How different it was from the wheezing of the toad. Rose listened to the song and was happy. It seemed to her that the nightingale was singing for her, and perhaps it was true. She did not see her enemy stealthily climbing up the branches. This time the toad was no longer sparing its legs or belly. Blood covered it, but it bravely climbed higher and higher, and suddenly, amidst the nightingale's sweet and tender singing, the rose heard a familiar wheezing. "I said I would eat, and I will." The toad's eyes stared at her intently from a neighboring branch. The evil animal had only one move left to grab the flower. Rose realized that she was dying. The little master had long been lying motionless on the bed. His sister, sitting at the headboard in a chair, thought he was asleep. On her lap lay an unfolded book, but she did not read it. Little by little, her weary head bowed. The poor girl had not slept for several nights without leaving her sick brother's side, and now she was dozing lightly. "Sarah," he whispered suddenly. The sister awoke. She dreamed that she was sitting at the window, that her little brother was playing, as last year, in the flower garden and calling her. When she opened her eyes and saw him in bed, thin and weak, she sighed heavily. "What, sweetheart?" "Sarah, you told me the roses were in bloom. May I have one?" "You may, my little dove, you may." She went to the window and looked at the bush. There was a single, but very lush rose. "It's just for you, and what a nice rose it is. Shall I put it here on the table in a glass? Yes?" "Yes, on the table. I'd like that." The girl took the scissors and went out into the garden. She had not been out of her room for a long time. The sun dazzled her and the fresh air made her a little dizzy. She came to the bush just as the toad was about to seize the flower. "Oh, what a nasty thing!" she shrieked, and grabbing the branch, she shook it violently. The toad fell to the ground and flopped down on its belly. In fury, it jumped at the girl, but it could not jump higher than the edge of her dress and immediately flew far away, thrown off by the toe of her shoe. She did not dare to try again, and only saw from a distance how the girl carefully cut the flower and carried it into the room. When the boy saw his sister with the flower in her hand, he smiled weakly for the first time after a long time and made a movement with his skinny hand. "Give it to me," he whispered. "I'll sniff it." His sister put the stem in his hand and helped him move it to his face. He inhaled the delicate fragrance and, smiling happily, whispered, "Ah, it feels so good." Then his countenance became serious and motionless, and he was silent forever. The rose, though cut before it began to crumble, felt that it had been cut for a reason. It was placed in a separate glass by the little coffin. There were whole bouquets of other flowers, but to tell the truth, no one paid any attention to them, and the young girl brought the rose to her lips and kissed it as she placed it on the table. A little tear fell from her cheek upon the flower, and it was the best incident in the life of the rose. When it began to wither, it was put in a thick old book and dried, and then, many years later, it was given to me. That's why I know the whole story.